I'm going to talk about COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic and human rights in Africa. And the question that it brings, which has been pushed by many countries or many governments in Africa, is either you have public health or you have respect of human rights. And I want to make it clear that it shouldn't be an either or. We can actually have both public health and human rights. In Nigeria in April 2020, when the government announced the lockdown, Nigerian security forces killed 18 people. And at that time, COVID had only killed 12 people. So 18 people were killed to enforce a lockdown over a pandemic that had killed only 12 people. What it basically shows is that the COVID pandemic was used to bring about restrictive measures to protect, in the name that it was going to protect and safeguard public health, which is legitimized, and it was used to legitimize inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment. And that spread across South Africa, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and people were beaten, people were inhumanly treated in the name of protecting public health. The second point is that the COVID-19 pandemic was used to expand the use of digital technology to protect public health. So the excuse was that we need to protect public health, and for us to be able to ensure that the lockdown is being followed, the restrictions that have been put are being followed, then we have to use digital technology, mass surveillance, tracking intelligence, and internet censorship. And the result of those measures being taken by governments in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in Kenya, in Uganda, was the arbitrary arrest and killings of people, simply because they were not following the restrictions that had been put in place. And the third point is the restriction of political and civil rights. So we would understand that, of course, people cannot protest if there is a pandemic, but that should not be an arbitrary rule that is just put across and there is no scientific evidence to prove, and they are no legitimate objectives for national interest. And what basically happened in countries like Uganda, which had elections recently, is that political participation and freedom of association, assembly, and expression were really muzzled because the government, the incumbent, Museveni, really wanted to ensure that the opposition is not able to campaign. So whereas the opposition supporters and opposition leaders were being arrested for flouting the regulations, the COVID-19 restrictions, the government Museveni was going across the whole world, not across the whole world, across Uganda, campaigning, doing exactly the same things that the opposition was being arrested for. In Zimbabwe, the same thing as well. The opposition and people who were protesting that the government has put up this lockdown, but it hasn't put any social safety mechanisms for people to be able to earn a living. I'm talking about a country where there is 90% unemployment and most people are living in the informal trade. So the government simply says there's going to be a lockdown and a curfew and no one is supposed to do anything, but there are no measures to be able to make sure that people leave. What basically happened is that people who were protesting against this and demanding that the government provide something were arrested because they were saying, you are going against the restrictions that have been put in place. But at the same time, the president of the country was moving around the country, having massive rallies and opening schools and opening buildings and bridges and stuff like that. So what basically shows is that the COVID-19 pandemic is actually being used to do what these leaders have always wanted to do: restrict political participation, shrink the civil society space, and then put massive surveillance mechanisms that will make it impossible for opposition politics to flourish. What is the effect of this thing? Because what has happened is as each country struggles with COVID-19, there is really no one who is checking to see the human rights violations that are being perpetrated. And the effect of it is that we are seeing a normalization of oppressive surveillance and undermining of human rights, which will be very difficult to reverse. the relegation of human rights to public health and respect of human rights, which is defined by these political leaders to suit their objectives. So the question then is, are we going to be able to gain what has been lost over this past year or so? And I think that it's going to be very difficult, as for instance, most people that are struggling for human rights in many African countries, they are not supported by their governments. Most human rights commissions that are statutory bodies, they are ill-funded, they are incapacitated. So most NGOs that support human rights have to receive funding and financing from the UK, from the US. And as these countries begin to cut foreign aid, then civil society organizations in many African countries, NGOs in many African countries, will find it very difficult to gain the spaces that they have gained before. And we're going to see more and more entrenchment of oppressive politics and leaders who basically flout human rights just at will. Thank you.